Today's topic, I think, will be of great interest to our audience because we're going to be talking about presentations. Next, we're going to focus on transitions. So you want to smoothly guide the audience. Now that we've talked about topic A, now I'm going to talk about topic B. You can think of it as a marker or a signpost to just reassure the audience about where you're going. So the next point we'll talk about is highlighting important points, things that you really want your audience to remember. So saying phrases, one thing I want to stress is fear of public speaking can be overcome. So that one thing I want to stress is a nice way to get the audience to focus on that point. And of course, I'm sure you've heard of the term takeaway. Takeaway, some of the important points. So if you take away only one thing from this presentation, remember that everyone has the power to become a better speaker. And then that really makes that point stay in the audience's minds. So, along with highlighting important points, there is, of course, a simple phrase when you're going to show some video, for example, or you're going to play some audio recordings. Let me draw your attention to the screen for a moment, where I'll show some statistics on the fears of public speaking. So let me draw your attention to. That's a nice way to get your audience to focus on something different. And then we can move on to talk a little bit more about audience questions and comments. Now, earlier, of course, we discussed what to do about inviting questions. But of course, there's also answering the questions when they come up. In an ideal situation, the audience will ask questions that you're prepared for. But as we know, sometimes the audience will ask a question that you're not really prepared for. It's natural to get quite nervous at that point. But remember a couple of things. One, you can hesitate to give yourself some time. Of course, we use a lot of and and so on. And that's, of course, acceptable in normal conversation. In a presentation, saying things like and is usually not considered very good because it gives the indication that the person isn't confident. So it's better to do different things instead. You may have noticed as we're speaking, there are times when I pause and I might be thinking about the next word. If you're not sure about a question, you can pause for a short amount. Also, saying something like, that's a great question. Then the reason people often say that is because they need that time to think a little bit more of an answer. That's a great question. What I would say is, in all of this time, I'm thinking about what the answer is. And it sounds more intelligent than and and so on. So don't be afraid to admit that you don't have the answer. This, of course, depends on the culture, but I would say in many English-speaking cultures, it's acceptable to admit when you don't know the answer. And it's better to admit that. I'm afraid I don't have the answer to your question right now, but I'll be happy to look it up and get back to you on that. Your audience will appreciate your honesty in most cases and appreciate that you're caring enough to get the right information rather than making up something just so that you don't look foolish. And then we can come to summing up the presentation. You do want to summarize the most important point, what the takeaway could be, for example. If there's one thing to take away from this presentation, it's that anyone can become a great public speaker. And you might also bring in some nice, kind words to give to the audience at the end. I hope you found this presentation informative, or I hope you found it useful. Thank you for listening. And this could also be a good point where you might share some contact information. And since we are talking about PowerPoints, there's a big cultural difference. From what I know, in Japan, these PowerPoints often have a lot of information and a lot of writing, which I think works quite well for kanji in the writing system because it's also, you have the image, the picture, as well as the writing. But of course, when you're talking about in English and in other languages, words are just words. If you see a PowerPoint that has a lot of English writing on it, it's actually very tiring. If you're going to use PowerPoints and have writing on them, it's better to leave it to keywords, bullet points. And be careful as a presenter not to read from the PowerPoints. What I mean is to be the person who's looking over and just reading off the PowerPoint, and you're not looking at the audience. Remember that the PowerPoint slides are there for the audience to follow along, not for the presenter, you, to read along.
How about gesture and eye contact? Do you have any advice?
Gestures, I think, depend on the person. As you might have noticed, I'm a person, I talk with my hands a lot. Not everyone is like that. And I also know there are cultural differences. So that's one thing to be aware of, is what your audience is comfortable with. If you are the type of person who doesn't feel comfortable gesturing, you don't necessarily have to, but some gestures here and there might help. Directing the attention, I'd like to direct your attention to the slides over here. Does anyone have any questions? You don't have to do it, but it doesn't hurt. One thing I would recommend is whatever you decide to do in terms of gestures, it's always good to practice your speaking in front of a mirror to see what you look like, or record yourself doing it and then watch it back, because what you actually look like may not and often doesn't match what's in your head, what you think you look like. And as for eye contact, again, this is the cultural difference. I know in Japan, it's considered a sign of respect, whereas looking at someone making eye contact can be aggressive. In North America, it shows honesty and that you're confident. And looking away shows a lack of confidence and that you're trying to hide something. It's good to have eye contact with your audience. But then the question is, of course, well, if you have a whole audience, how are you supposed to make eye contact with everyone? Obviously, you don't have eye contact with everyone. You can maybe occasionally look at certain people in the audience. Kind of the idea, okay, I see you there, I see you there, I see you there. If the audience, the whole audience sees that, that gives a sense of confidence and honesty. And if you're really not comfortable with making eye contact, for example, maybe look to the back of the auditorium, you can kind of cheat. Look at the tops of people's heads. You're not actually making eye contact, but you're close enough to where you're doing that. Now, of course, we're in the era of making presentations over Zoom. So how do you make eye contact in that way? Well, one big mistake that people make is, of course, when you have the screen, when you have the view of the other person looking at their face. So on my screen here, if I was looking at your face here, then I look like I'm not making eye contact, even though I'm looking at you on the screen. In Zoom, of course, and many other programs, you can minimize the window and move it so it's just underneath the camera. So that way, when I'm looking at you, I'm looking in the direction of the camera, and it gives the impression I'm making eye contact. Or if you're comfortable with it, you can even just look directly at the camera. And that way, if you look at the camera, you're making eye contact with everyone. Those are my recommendations for eye contact in the age of the internet and Zoom presentations.
Recently, we have lots of webinars and Zoom presentations. That advice is very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.